My name is Thomas Haire. I'm the Chief Content Officer of the Performance Driven Marketing Institute. And we're back for our 2:30 session. We thank everybody for being here at the show. We thank all of our sponsors, all of our attendees. We thank the hotel, the Eden Rock, for hosting us. We also want to say a special thanks to our education sponsor, Pacific Media Technologies. They've got a brief video to share.
Our team is bar none. I mean, together as a family, pretty much, family niche.
You've got people that are easy to talk to. They don't mind if you come to them with problems. They're easy to work with.
I'm happy working with my coworkers, and I can't wait to get here.
They deliver work that they're proud of, and it shows.
Pacific Media Technologies. Technology driven, quality guaranteed.
So thank you again to PMT. We appreciate your support. Today, we are here to talk about the regulatory minefield. Our Government Affairs Council, the PDMI, one of our more important councils, has put this presentation together. The Government Affairs Council works for us with regulators, particularly the FTC. We've been active at the PDMI over the last couple of years and being involved in public comment on a number of items. We'll continue to do that thanks to our Government Affairs Council, and we appreciate their support. Today, we have Roger Colaizzi, who's chair of Venable's National Advertising Litigation Group. Roger stepping in for Len, who I believe got called out to a meeting in Seattle, so I guess you won the weather war there. For sure. For sure. Roger has significant trial experience litigating Lanham Act false advertising, state deceptive trade practices, unfair competition, advertising class actions, and more. He's represented clients before agencies like the FTC and the CFPB and self-regulating bodies like the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau. On my right is Linda Goldstein, who's the co-leader of BakerHostetler's advertising, marketing, and digital media team. Linda provides advertising counsel and regulatory advice to leading Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies, representing clients in investigative and enforcement proceedings brought by the FTC, state attorneys general, district attorneys, and more. She spends a considerable portion of her time advising clients on how to minimize the legal risks associated with mobile marketing, e-retail, social influencers, native advertising, email marketing, and more. Welcome to both of you. We thank you both for being here today, and we appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy schedules to join us. What we're going to talk about here today, and we've prepared a little bit for this, was, oftentimes we talk about deceptive advertising cases and those types of things, but the FTC is really activating in so many different areas that we wanted to focus a little bit on some of those business areas that they're looking into. As well as getting back into dark patterns, which is one of the hot things. We wanted to figure out three topics really that we were going to focus on that have taken the center stage in recent months. The first one being its interest in regulating business practices, digging deeper into businesses beyond serving as authority on deceptive advertising. Linda, I'm going to go to you first. Why do you think the FTC is expanding its reach in this way?
Because I think the chair, who's at the helm, Lena Khan, has very specific, what I would say are, largely anti-tech, anti-large business views of the world, and she believes it is part of her mission to use whatever powers she has, or powers she may not exactly have, but it's unclear whether she has those powers or doesn't have those powers, to try to regulate market conditions that she thinks are anti-competitive. I mean, to be clear, the FTC, there's a Bureau of Consumer Protection, there's a Bureau of Competition. What's happening here, however, is that some of this, I would say, market regulating activity is coming out of the Consumer Protection Bureau, not necessarily out of competition. And the most recent sort of example that I think caught a lot of folks by surprise and is potentially could be very disruptive to the business community is they've announced a proposed rulemaking that would prohibit businesses from requiring employers to sign restrictive covenants the devil's in the details, but all indications now are that a restrictive covenant would be very, very broadly defined without regard to time or placement restrictions, as is common under most state laws. And they have already begun bringing enforcement actions against companies, and they're not large companies. So I think that's noteworthy as well. These are companies that, for whom the cost of replacing talent is probably a little bit more expensive than other companies. And the consent orders that they've made them sign essentially take that similarly broad view of a restrictive covenant. And the other thing, if they do go forward with the rule as they've described what they're thinking of doing, it would be retroactive. So companies would be required to go back and release employees from restrictive covenants that they've signed. So it's a pretty bold action.
It is. Roger, your thoughts?
I agree with what Linda said about where the FTC is these days, and with the restrictive covenants, just to put a finer point on it, these are basically non-compete agreements, right? And I think we're going to touch on that a little later. And it started probably with their rulemaking. Their proposed rulemaking gives them the ability to seek redress where they've lost some of those rights, try to get more injunctive relief. But also, I think that when you look back in February of last year, they had a proposed rulemaking for earnings claims. Now, it's a broad, in the end of last year, a proposed rulemaking on business opportunities. And so you end up with things like business coaching, mentoring programs, e-commerce. We're going to get into health. I know that Linda is correctly mentioned that it is something that we really need to focus on today. And so the FTC under Chair Khan has really, I think you put your finger on it, Linda, is using the consumer protection side to further some of her efforts on the competitive side, kind of as a precursor. And when you do have companies that can't afford to really fight the FTC, then the FTC starts making some precedent that then they'll go into court and say, well, we've already established that this is wrong and we shouldn't have to go through that again. And then it used to be that the FTC would find an area that they wanted to focus some attention on and would bring an action, and that would serve as the example of where the FTC is looking to enforce consumer protection. But now it's more of an agenda that if they don't like a business, they'll go after it, and also are finding ways to have more control beyond maybe what they're entitled to.
Right. Yeah, I think we're going to the non-competes here. I think when you talk about non-competes, it's a distinct challenge for this industry, having covered and provided education for the industry for 20 years. You come to know that most of the businesses in this space have non-competes, especially the agencies, the vendors. What does this mean for them? Like where, it seems, again, to Linda's point, they're throwing a reel out there and hoping, to your point, that this becomes standard now. And is there a hope for non-competes as an existing contract standard at this point?
Well, I mean, there's still a long ways to go on whether this will ever become a rule, and people shouldn't panic. But most businesses have some level of non-compete. And oftentimes it relates to trade secrets, it relates to intellectual property, and those are things that need to be protected. And so I'm sure companies, if they're not now, they should be looking to find other ways to protect that information other than a non-compete. There are basically three aspects of those, of the FTC's proposed rulemaking. One is just an outright ban on any non-competes, which will trump state law, at least that's the idea. So you have various states look at non-competes in different ways with respect to how long and how broad, taking into account that people should not be prohibited from working. By the same token, there is a real need for a non-compete to protect the business and, frankly, to make businesses competitive with each other. So that's kind of point one. Point two is, as Linda mentioned, the FTC wants to cause all companies to rescind current non-competes or restrictive covenants on employees, and employees defined very broadly to go up to the highest levels of a company, the way the FTC is proposing it. And so this rule, if it's passed, would require companies to not only rescind the non-competes, but to notify the workers that the non-compete has been rescinded and that they are no longer prohibited from using whatever information they may have. And then last, there is a very, very, very narrow exception, and that's when small businesses are being sold and the owner has at least 25% of the business, then there can remain in place a non-compete for a short period of time. I forget what it is, 25 days or something. It's very short.
I mean, how close are we?
I don't think we're close at all, actually, because first of all, the FTC has initiated so many different rulemakings, and we'll talk about some of the others here. They really don't have the capacity to do all of these, and the rulemaking process is typically a fairly long process. In addition to that, it's fairly likely, if I were a betting person, I would bet on this, that if they do go forward with this, it's going to be challenged in court. So I think it's going to be held up for quite some time. And there are lots of rumors that Chair Khan may be going back to teach at Columbia, or is it is it Columbia or Georgetown?
I think you're right. Yeah.
Anyway, that she might be going back to teach, and if that happens, we'll see. This is definitely, this piece of the agenda is definitely being driven by her. So, it remains to be seen. But the damage that's being caused, at least with respect to companies that they've already brought enforcement actions against, is a problem. And typically, when they're engaged in rulemaking, they beef up their enforcement actions. So what I think it does mean is companies will still remain very much a target for their non-competes, because they like to bring enforcement actions to create a record when they try to pass the rule to say, this is a really serious problem. Look how many enforcement actions we've had to bring. And then you might think, well, if you're already bringing the enforcement actions, why do you need a rule? And the reason they want the rule is what Roger alluded to, is because their ability to get money just by going into court has now been stripped or made much more complicated. If they pass a rule and you violate the rule, there are automatic civil penalties. So all of this is a roundabout way to really impact a fairly common, not only common market practice, but a market practice that is heavily regulated at the state level, and businesses for decades have been developing their restrictive covenants based on the applicable state laws, and upend all of that, and then essentially create a predicate to get money.
That's a really important tool in companies staying competitive too. I mean, it's kind of anti-competitive, which is not what the FTC should be doing.
But I think if I were, I don't think it's going to change for most. I think most companies have appropriate restrictive covenants. They spend a lot of time thinking about how broadly to draft those and to draft them as narrowly as possible to achieve their goals. But I would pay attention to it just to hopefully avoid being a target of an enforcement action. Presumably, the FTC, I think on this one, is probably going to go after the companies that don't have the money to fight them. because if they try to go after, I don't know what Amazon has, for example, but Amazon's not going to sign a consent order that says we can't have restrictive covenants in the future. They're going to take them to court and fight it there. So unfortunately, it probably is the smaller businesses that are going to be hit by this.
Speaking of essentially looking to override kind of existing state rules that are accepted, we go into data privacy now. It seems like across most of the country, California has the most restrictive data privacy rules. It seems like that's kind of being enacted across most marketing plans, but it seems like the FTC now wants to supersede and become the authority here. What should marketers really be most concerned about when it comes to data privacy and the FTC looking to create its own rules?
So I think one of the things that's probably most relevant to our industry, and we saw it in a recent enforcement action, is that this commission, and particularly Commissioner Slaughter, they hate targeted advertising. They believe it's inherently nefarious. They just entered into a consent agreement with a company called BetterHelp, which they did some bad stuff. I mean, they shared sensitive mental health information, but there's a provision in their consent order that bans essentially the sharing of any information for targeted advertising purposes, and that's a precursor to where they're going with this. They're looking at, and again, rulemaking on commercial surveillance and privacy, and that's all about targeted advertising, and their goal would really be, if not to ban it entirely, to at least convert it to a very strong opt-in regime, which no one, no state has done yet. And we are seeing, Roger, you probably are too, any case we have now that has a privacy component to it, they are looking for order provisions that go well beyond what any law requires. They really are looking for, in some cases, they're looking for total opt-ins. In other cases, they're looking for complete bans on the use of information, either for certain purposes or use of sensitive information. But again, like the restrictive covenants, this is an area where they are unwilling to, there is no, at the moment, federal privacy legislation, and there's, a pretty robust foundation of state legislation, and they are unwilling to abide by those limitations.
Now, was BetterHelp, was what was in BetterHelp, was that expected in any way, given what they've been looking to do?
Well, I mean, if you look at the complaint in BetterHelp, there are some allegations that BetterHelp did some bad advertising, and they had a HIPAA seal implying that everything was HIPAA compliant. They had other aspects that made consumers think that it was a safe place. They ended up giving data, personal information about individuals relating to health and violating HIPAA, frankly. And so it was an easier case. FTC picks its cases, as Linda and I've mentioned, to be able to create laws and rules and precedent that allow them to go after other companies and bigger companies to do that. And so when you think about how people are trying to use data to better serve consumers, in a positive way and not in a negative way, and complying with the laws, then you're having, again, you're kind of interrupting competition. And if you go to a point where you can't use data, when you think about all these different laws that already exist that deal with how you can use data, what your privacy policies are, how they're being used, and that they are enforcing, the FTC and others are enforcing those privacy policies, this is effectively overriding all of these other laws that are in place from states and the federal government that say, we're just going to wipe it all out. You just can't do it anymore.
Right.
And we used to, there are many times when you would be representing a company in a particular category in an industry, and you think, maybe the FTC just doesn't like this business, and they're doing everything they can to get rid of it. But now with the proposed rulemaking that has multiple purposes for why they're doing it, this is we're going to change this in a way that we don't even need these other laws. Let's just ban it. So while they might be trying to get this, and they are getting it in the consent decree for better health, then you're starting that precedent of let's just ban this kind of conduct because, as Linda pointed out, there's a desire not to have it. Commissioner Slaughter is like, I don't think that people should be subject to having be served ads that they might be interested in, as opposed to just bombarding them.
I mean, it's the essence of performance marketing, of direct marketing, right? Targeting ads. Next topic, obviously we covered a lot of that right there. Next topic, the new health compliance guidelines. Linda, as we were leading up to this, you were clear that we needed to talk about this in this diversion spotlight. Can you tell us why?
So the biggest change, so just for a little bit of background, there has been guidance for the marketing of dietary supplements. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, which basically sets out, types of claims that are permissible, not permissible, what kind of substantiation you need, what good testing consists of. The FTC has basically taken all of the guidance that it has issued with respect to dietary supplements and has now broadened that guidance to include all health-related health benefit claims. And so the biggest change is that the category of products that are effectively covered by the new guidance could include foods, devices, cosmetics, really anything that makes a health-related benefit. And the FTC has consistently over the years been much more rigorous in what it believes is necessary to substantiate health claims. There was litigation over whether you had to have at least one double-blind placebo-controlled clinical study. After a whole series of bouts, basically where it netted out was you have to have at least one. Maybe in some cases you might need two. Maybe you still had room to argue that you don't really need one, although it would most likely be a losing proposition with the FTC. But this guidance makes also pretty clear that you need at least one double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical study meeting the gold standard for pretty much any health-related claim. Pretty much any health-related claim, not just dietary supplements. A lot of what's in there just is a repetition of things that they've said before. One of the other things that really struck me that I think we're going to really have to keep an eye on and see what enforcement looks like is what they talk about qualified claims, and they make the statement that any health-related claims need to be appropriately qualified. If you look at one of the examples, and a lot of this they do by way of example, which is completely non-helpful because if your case doesn't fit into the example, you don't really have clear guidance. But putting that aside, one of the examples they gave as far as appropriate qualifications is if you have two examples. You have a product that helps reduce fatigue, but there's some evidence that it could increase blood pressure. You would have to disclose the fact that it could increase your blood pressure. So I think the level of consideration, particularly if you're not in the drug arena, of what are potential risks is something marketers are going to have to think about now. And another example they gave is if you did your study and, let's say only 40% of people, it's not the number they used, but it could be any number, experienced a benefit, they suggested you might have to disclose the fact that, well, not everyone gets the benefit. Well, I think everybody knows that not every product works for everyone, and the standard historically has been, do you have statistically significant results? But some of the examples they've put out in terms of what they would consider to be appropriately qualified health benefits, I think is some cause for concern. But again, the biggest difference in this is that it's category agnostic, really, product agnostic. Anything that has a health benefit associated with it would be subject to these guides.
Right.
So in theory, exercise products and other kind of dietary supplements, of course. There's also an app that they want medical app developers to go through, and there's a series of questions, and if that developer answered all those questions, then it would tell them what category they're in. And some of these questions are, for whom are you developing the app? Is it a HIPAA compliant company, or is it a HIPAA required company, right? And so as you're basically providing the FTC's information in advance to, I guess, get on their radar screen, right? To be a potential target. But I think the ultimate problem here, in addition to what Linda has said, is that when you, and again, I keep going back to, because the more time I've spent thinking about this, this is almost anti-competitive, right? This is another area where the FTC does not want to, and look, legitimately, if there are people out there making health claims that should be stopped, great, but that's already happening now. You don't need to have additional guidance and a questionnaire to determine whether you're doing it appropriately. And I think that, as with some of the other things we've been talking about today, this is more a constraint on the ability for companies to provide consumers with things that could be helpful. It makes it more difficult instead of having clear guidance on how the FTC or the FDA or others might look at enforcing this area.
Yeah. Now, we have to keep in mind that guidelines are just guidelines. They're not law. But how seriously should we approach these guidelines?
So again, because it's not a rule yet or a law, they can't run right in and get civil penalties, but when the FTC brings an enforcement action, they consider their guidance to be the rule of law. So in terms of how will you fare against the FTC, those guidelines are going to control.
Right. And again, they create a record and then go back and say, well, see, this is all happening. This is why we need to do this. It sounds to me that how can, given what they're looking at, how can health claims ever be qualified at this point? Is there concern that that's where they're headed? You're not going to be able to qualify any health claim?
I think it gives them just another, my experience, the way I would sum up my experience overall with the FTC, with dietary supplements and health claims, is they've never seen a study they liked. So I would say that this just gives them, this piece on is it appropriately qualified, it gives them another area of attack, because any study you do is going to show some limit, right? And then they can come in and say, well, there was a limitation here. You didn't disclose that limitation. So it's just, I don't know that it, in terms of, current, really any, other than maybe I think the exercise industry is a big one, because previously they have said that is the one place you do not need a robust double-blind clinical study. And how would you do that anyway with an exercise program? I mean, you're either doing the exercise or you're not doing the exercise. I mean, you can't make dummy weights. So, so I don't know where they're going to go with that. But the guidance is pretty much what they've been doing for years, and they've become increasingly critical of the studies they see. So for the most part, I think it's just going to be more of the same. They're just going to have a bigger playground to play with.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously the FTC is again expanding to contract what businesses can do. And you remember, Linda, back in the day, if you had a consent decree for a dietary supplement company, and it was the older type of substantiation that was considered competent and reliable, the FTC would go back, sue the company again, and try to change, seek a non-compliance with the consent decree, and seek to change it to a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, even though there were really no violations. And that's the experiences that we've had in those types of cases. And they're effectively trying to do it again, but instead of giving guidance, this is what you need, they're saying, we're looking at these claims and we're not seeing, not only do you not have, or maybe you don't have the type of substantiation that we would like to see, but also you're not, we're not going to tell you what you need, but we're telling you that it's not good enough. And so it's hard for a business to go and provide a product, have substantiation for it. And I know we're going to get into dark patterns, but what the FTC is doing is saying, on the one hand, when it was weight loss or products like that, there was a period of time where if you wanted to have a weight loss product or exercise, you knew exactly what to do. If it wasn't typical, you could no longer say not typical, but you had to say what was typical. You could still have the examples of how people lost weight, and then as long as you said this is what everybody would expect to achieve if you did the program. Now it's, you don't even have that, right? So you look at a medical claim or something that may support a health benefit, and if it doesn't work for 100% of the people or a large majority of the people, then the FTC is saying, well, you need to give all this information in order to tell the consumers that it may not work for them. In other words, you have to say something that is going to cause consumers not to want to buy the product.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into dark patterns, but so I'm going to throw it way back, a decade and a half at least. In our previous lifetime at Response Magazine, we did a thing where I did Power 90, the original Power 90, not P90X. I did Power 90. Every month in my column, I updated how I was doing. I lost 37 pounds in 90 days. And at the time, that was outside the standard of what they could have claimed. It was funny. I mean, but to your point, all I did was the exercise. I did the exercise. I followed the food thing. But I think the standard at the time was 2.5 pounds a week, and I was closer to 3 pounds a week. So I was outside of standard. But now, what you're saying now is there's just no standard.
No standard that.
No claim, like there's no claim they can make that can't be challenged.
There's no but I think that's the best way of putting it. There's no claim that can be made that can't be challenged.
There's no safe claim.
Right. I mean, we've always talked about trying to advise clients about here's how you can reduce the risk. Here's what at minimum, you need to do, A through Z to make sure that you're under the radar of regulators. There's always some level of risk. But now, if you follow all those rules, well, there may be something that the FTC might say, well, we think that is misleading to consumers. And when we get to the dark pattern.
Yeah, I mean, even just to, and it kind of ties in with the qualified claims, like even the, lose 2 pounds, okay, in 5 days, which you could, because you're going to lose water.
Water weight, yeah.
Okay. And we've had these cases where they've said, well, you need to tell the consumer that's just the first 5 days, because the consumer is going to think that means I'm going to lose 2 pounds every 5 days, and you need to let them know that that's not going to continue at that rate. And so, again, that's just that's a statement that has been, if you do a good exercise diet program, most people, that would be a truthful statement, but you can't necessarily just rely on that statement anymore.
Right. Makes sense. Last piece, dark patterns. We've talked about this over many of our recent conversations at our PDMI events. Let's flip the script a little bit. They seem to be going past traditional concepts of consumer deception here. I'll start with you, Roger. Can you tell us what's happening here and what it might mean for performance marketing companies?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's, aside from what we just mentioned, where there's no, that whatever you advertise could always be subject to a view from the FTC that we think this is misleading to consumers, right? And it's always, from the very first time I did an FTC case, I was appalled at the concept that I guess is still there, that the FTC can say, we are the experts in advertising, and we think it's false and misleading, so therefore it is. And in many federal courts, that was enough to get an asset freeze and put a company out of business. And so when you get into these dark patterns and it's without definition of how you might go forward, it's just that we think consumers are being deceived, that it makes it very difficult to be compliant. And, I think that maybe there are some courts that are maybe pushing back some, where you have, and there were a couple Ninth Circuit opinions having to do with arbitration clauses, and one, the link or the reference to the arbitration was in very light gray text. It was hard to see. In the other, it was very clear what the link was, and you could click on it and you could go. And so the Ninth Circuit said, no, how do you expect people to see that, to know what they're agreeing to when it comes to arbitration? And that arbitration requirement that many in the industry are using now to try to avoid long court battles, but to tell consumers, if you buy this product and you want to keep using it, you're going to be subject to an arbitration agreement that you're agreeing to by opening the box or using the product or purchasing it, whatever the case might be, in the medium of delivery to the consumer. And that's been very important to many businesses in this space. But the Ninth Circuit has been able to say this is not good disclosure as to what is happening for the consumers. Too hard to see. It's gray on a white background. The next case was it's very clear what you're getting into. You're agreeing to an arbitration agreement, and this is a proper disclosure. And so while these weren't FTC cases, they were cases where a class action lawyer is trying to avoid an arbitration provision, but it is applicable to what the FTC is doing in terms of saying that, well, we think in our great wisdom that this is deceptive to consumers and they wouldn't understand everything about this product that we think they should know. And so this is a pattern that you're using to try to deceive consumers. And so that's where I think dark patterns are going. It's just it's like a catch-all phrase in a contract that you can say, well, you're breaching the contract, like a business deal. But this is, kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the definition of a dark pattern. The line, as Roger said, the line between a dark pattern and good effective marketing is just completely blurred. And You know, one of the things that's, I think also a little bit alarming about this is that the way they measure the presence of a dark pattern is by conversion rates. So in one of the cases they brought on dark patterns, which was a case against Credit Karma, Credit Karma A/B tested two different lines. One was pre-qualified and the other was something like you could get credit. Well, let's see, you probably didn't even need the A/B testing to figure out which one was going to do better. And their Exhibit A in their complaint was the evidence that there was a dark pattern was they tested these two and pre-qualified performed better. And they think they've found the holy grail in A/B testing. We're seeing that in investigations now where they want to see all the A/B testing. And so companies that are, you know, I mean, it's like food and water to a marketing company to do A/B testing. All of that now potentially, even with the best of intentions, you pick the creative that is the most compelling. You are now at risk of being accused of engaged in a dark pattern. And what we're also seeing is in the consent orders, and this has been in some of the recent consent orders, the FTC is requiring the businesses to maintain records of their A/B testing. And you know, in a digital world, how much A/B testing is happening?
Constantly.
It's dynamic, and so that's why I think they think they've somehow found the holy grail in this, that this is going to be their smoking gun in future cases. It's really, really dangerous in terms of how every marketer operates, that this is somehow going to be a measure of deception.
But just to put a finer point on that, Linda and I were on a case together, and this company was doing gobs of A/B testing, and even to the point where they would test one color background against another, and putting aside, you know, there's nothing that was faded out in a white on white or anything like that, but just different colors. So the FTC would look at that and say, well, you're getting a higher conversion rate with pink, and therefore you must be deceiving consumers, and that's a dark pattern. That's what I would frankly hear them say about that today. And you know, how do you even? It's basically any marketing that is going to drive sales is a dark pattern, particularly if A/B testing is involved. And this, I don't know if you remember that case.
I do.
At the beginning of that case, Linda, where the FTC was taking the position that, and they had an expert who bailed out, but the idea was that consumers read a page in a certain way, and because the advertisement was, you know, on one part of the page, that means that consumers wouldn't see it. And when we pushed for the evidence of that, we never got an expert report. But it's that kind of view that, and I don't think they'd like that again, that category of business. So how do we stop this?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this leads us down the path of e-commerce because a lot of this stuff is found online. I mean, a lot of the stuff they're going after is found online. Are there other red flags present in the e-commerce area when it comes to what the FTC is looking into?
Well, I think also, I mean, maybe this fits into dark pattern, but you know, I think that we all grew up thinking that as long as you make all of the material disclosures to a consumer before they actually click the button to purchase, and I'm not including subscription because that's subject to ROSCA, that's a whole different story, but in the, you know, just normal purchase flow, you would typically think that as long as you made all those disclosures before the consumer was obligated to pay, you were fine. And now we're seeing a desire, what they call first impression, misimpression. So the later in the process that you make the disclosure, there's a greater likelihood the FTC will say, you just dumped these on the consumer at the last minute when they were already getting to the shopping cart and they were already, emotionally, they'd already emotionally signed up to the transaction. Now, a variation of that, which is its own unique focus, are what they're calling drip pricing, which is certain fees aren't disclosed until the end, ones that might be expected, but even ones that are not expected. So shipping and handling, taxes, other fees that the consumer can be charged. Actually, in the Dark Patterns report, they came out and emphatically said all fees that a consumer will be charged should be disclosed upfront. And even if, it could be extensive, where a link would be a much more effective way, or a pop-up, and they'll also say, well, those disclosures are not unavoidable, so therefore they're not effective. So, and I would say overall, I'm just going to get philosophical now for a minute. They don't appreciate that media is evolving, and they continue to look at the world in a very linear way, even though everybody operates on multiple screens, and they just don't see it. And I think the more space constrained media becomes, or the more you move to shoppable ads where you have 15 seconds to get the whole thing in there. They're, I think, creating barriers to those forms of commerce that most consumers actually find very convenient.
Right.
And so, I worry about where that's going to go in the future.
Yeah, Roger.
Well, I'm thinking about two things. One is, when you have a very good client who may be kind of a leader in the industry and is doing all the right things and working hard, if the FTC has spent any amount of time looking at it, then they consider themselves to be invested in it, and they're not walking away, I'd say even more so today than any time in the past. Once they've spent any amount of time, they're going to pursue it to the end and try to get a settlement, or even the FTC, when the Justice Department refuses to take a case, the FTC is still pushing the case, right? And I think about that, and it is again an impediment to good competition, which is a benefit to consumers because they're getting lower prices, better quality products, and so forth. We used to do, and we still do, consumer perception surveys, and the general rule on that, at least in federal court, where you bring in a survey, if you could show that 20% of the people are deceived or confused, then you have enough to bring a to win a false advertising case. But now, with what the FTC is doing, we think it's confusing, we think it's deceptive, and we think that if anybody is confused, and we're not even talking about the reasonable person, anybody is confused and you don't disclose to that person or that group of people, that 5% of people who just don't get it, then it's a deceptive advertisement. And it's very hard to, you can help clients put together a very low risk advertising campaign, but you're always going to say, the FTC may still come knocking on your door. And once that happens, then you have the class action lawyers following suit, and it can put smaller companies out of business, or even put smaller companies in a position of not being able to afford to fight the FTC. They don't have, they spend as much time and money as they want. They don't have any limits, and so once you're in the crosshairs, you're either going to spend a lot of money or succumb to a settlement that you really shouldn't have to sign.
Makes sense. We close in on the hour here. Last question from me. If you can select one thing for our attendees to take away from today's conversation, what would it be?
Well, I mean, look, it's more than just the FTC. You have the CFPB, you have the FDA, you have a lot of agencies out there looking with more scrutiny, following suit with the FTC. I mean, the CFPB doesn't want to be left behind. They want to do whatever the FTC is doing, right? And to me, you know, obviously, you really have to pay attention. You really have to have in place some kind of compliance policy, compliance effort within the company, or to get outside counsel to help, and make sure that your company is looking at all the right things. Doesn't guarantee you won't be a target, but it certainly lowers that risk. And it really is the highest priority for businesses. And they're really, on some of these things that we've talked about earlier, some of it is anticipatory compliance, right? So when you get to the restrictive covenants, yeah, I agree. That's going to be hard for the FTC to get as a rule. But by the same token, there are other ways to protect important assets and intellectual property of a company that companies should be looking at to, just in case, that this becomes an issue. It's not something you can say the rule comes out and now I've got to find another way. Just can't pivot that fast. So it's good to make sure that you are anticipating some of the requirements that these advanced notice of proposed rules is put out there, so you can start thinking about what would I do if this rule passed.
Linda?
I would say two things, and they revolve around risk. I think for all companies, you might have to adjust your risk tolerance level up a notch just because of the environment. So things, look, most of this, we're living in a very gray area, but I find myself, even though we always try to find a way to get to yes, I find myself in some areas where we know there are hot buttons for the FTC to say, look, you could take the risk. If it were my company, I might not do this at this time. And the other thing I would say, which relates to risk, is don't take silly risks on small things that aren't going to move the needle for the company. Because to Roger's point, what we have found is the FTC may come in because they think there's a problem with something, and there's no there, but instead of going away, they don't go away. They'll shift the focus to see if they can find something else. And before this administration, we never had that, where they will literally issue a whole new subpoena and go after something they never thought of before because they just don't want to leave it alone. And so, sometimes you think, well, we're just going to test this, or we're just running this in social media, and I'll turn around and say, okay, and if that's the thing that ends up costing you a consent order, is it worth it to the business? So it's a different risk calculation.
That makes sense. It makes sense. Thank you both. Time for questions from the audience, if anyone has a question. Right back there.
One question, and I guess looking at the government and having those regulations turn into law or fact, right? That's a double-edged sword. So you can't really take that and say, okay, well, let's let the government kind of decide what the rules of the road are going to be as a law, right? Because then everybody's screwed. What if the companies you guys are describing were to do something that we did with pharma back when pharma opened up, and you have the ability to reference the ad in a print magazine or something like, check out our, more detailed whatever online. Does that solve the problem? And to all the points you made, it sounds like it might. Would that be something that could work in this environment? Because it seems like the FTC is just kind of willy-nilly making things up as they go, which is kind of weird considering it's a government body, right? So, we all have to abide by things, and if they're coming in like, some bad organization, then what else can be done? Can we do something like what I described to, offset things? Or?
So I think it's a great idea. I don't think it would fly for the FTC for two reasons. First of all, in the prescription drug area, for the most part, you're still, you got to go through your doctor. So somebody can't see something, the FTC is going to assume they're never going to the website, right? So they're never going to read that. But at least with, prescription drugs, hopefully you have a doctor that you trust, and they're sort of watching out for your best interests. The other thing I think to keep in mind is that the FDA and the FTC are actually, they're very different organizations, and I'm not going to by any means say the FDA is perfect, but they're a much more black and white organization. And so, in fact, they don't, obviously they go through a lot of rigorous review as well, but there have been times where not in the prescription drug area, but certainly in the dietary supplement area, where claims have been approved on label, and the FTC has said, we don't care, it's misleading. So they're a different animal.
There's no harm in doing that. I think I agree with what Linda just said about the FTC is going to assume that nobody's going to go and check that out. But if you, depending on what the product is and how it's being sold and how it's being advertised, there's a lot of things the FTC, most things the FTC would say, you can't have somebody click a link to get more information, right? And I could think of maybe a few products where you might say, here's what we're doing, and to get more information, you should go to our website because there's more detail there. And maybe it's grass fertilizer or something where you want to learn how it's working, or look at the label to see what kind of chemicals are in it or something. Where it's not, it's hard to say that it's some kind of a misleading aspect of the ad, right? You're just offering more information to better understand it. But anything that, I think the FTC would also say, anything that you feel that somebody ought to go to a website to get more information on, you should probably disclose that in very large print right where you're offering the product. And so it's a little bit about beating your head against the wall and trying to do a catch-all that the FTC has their own catch-all, right, that we talked about. But it's still, there's no harm in it, I don't think.
Chicken soup is.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Linda, Roger, awesome job today. Tremendous information. Thank you for sharing. I feel like I'm really excited that we taped this, because I think every single member of the PDMI has to listen to what you guys had to share today. And we're going to have an opportunity to replay this after the fact, which is great. You guys scared me a little bit today when you talked about how much the FTC is watching things like A/B testing. I feel like every marketer, everybody in this industry does A/B testing, and we're all probably at risk of being in violation. What are the repercussions of getting caught by the FTC for doing something you wouldn't realize that you're doing something wrong, but you might have gotten caught for A/B testing as a dark pattern, as Roger had mentioned? What does a violation look like? Is it a slap on the wrist? How big of a financial violation is it? And is there tiers, first time, second time, third time being caught?
Well, first of all, with the A/B testing, there's different levels of A/B testing, right? I gave an example of you're changing colors, right? And if the money were there, I would take that as far as it would go, right? It's ridiculous for the FTC to say you can't use a color because it's deceptive. By the same token, if you're on A, you're disclosing something that's critical for the consumer to know, and on the B side, you're not disclosing that, or you're taking a bigger risk. That's a really big risk, because you're taking away something that you think might cause the consumer to buy a product when they otherwise wouldn't, right? And so, nobody's hopefully is trying to do that to try to deceive the consumer intentionally. But when you have A/B testing sitting there, and that's the evidence, exhibit number 1, it really is exhibit 1 for the FTC. That's like a smoking gun type of thing where you're taking away something that everybody knows should be disclosed. What's the risk? What's the harm? It could be a consent judgment, which then is going to follow the company and the officers around forever. even though there is I guess there's sort of a limitation on the years, but it's out there. And, you know, officers of companies, small and large, have to disclose that everywhere they go. And it, you know, prevents good business people from getting on boards of directors that are important to other companies because they have this consent decree. They have to disclose that. And so both when it's, you know, deserved violation and should be a consent decree, and when it's, you know, as we would say, the FTC should not be doing that. And, you know, it's an unfortunate consent decree because you're only settling because you can't afford to litigate. Then, you know, yeah, there can be some really big consequences to individuals and companies.
Absolutely. Well, we are about out of time here, folks. I'd love to hear a round of applause for Linda and Roger for sharing their time today. We appreciate it very much.